like a forest or something. And then I tried to describe this particular pattern that I had come up with, where I took the notes on the piano, which I've done all my life. I've been fascinated with the keyboard design, and I've often wondered why there's so weird things like these black notes and white notes, and they're in a symmetrical pattern, but it's 12 notes, and our hands are symmetrical, but we only have 10 fingers. And there's 12 notes, and all these patterns are very complicated. I'm always looking for ways to simplify things. And also I play the trombone, and in the case of the trombone, you have to conceptualize where all these notes are. Are they in space? Are they in your head? How do you know where they are? And so ever since I was probably 15, visiting my sister Lindy, who was at school at Oberlin, and she was studying psychology, she hooked me up to an EEG machine and recorded my brain waves. And of course, what I thought was, you could play music this way. You could hook this machine up to some sort of instrument or something, and you could play with your brain. And that immediately started me thinking about different ways to take the concept of music and musical notes and try deal with them in a way that was more personalized for me. At any rate, I can show this slide here. You may not be able to see it, but in probably 1981, when Liza was 1 year old, I took apart a very inexpensive electronic organ, and I reordered all the notes into another pattern instead of the black and white pattern of the keys. And then I started looking at it. Was a really fun pattern, and I involved the symmetrical aspect of the piano keyboard, but I put all the notes in these cubes, and then I started plotting actual musical relationships using my system, and I came up with all these patterns that fascinated me. So mostly that was kind of a dangerous instrument. I called it the toxic touch organ because it had lead solder involved, and I had these little children around, and they wanted to play it, and so if they did, I had to put masks on and rubber gloves and things for them to play it.
We know what's wrong.
Anyway, so that kind of went in the sidelines for a while. So skipping ahead, I was messing around with the piano keyboard again, and I started thinking, well, these 12 notes, we're always dividing them by 2, and it's divisible by 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. And I started thinking, what if you had 3 hands and were trying to play the piano? What kinds of problems would you come across? And then I plotted, quite simply, I said, okay, here's a note, and I made a point. And I thought, well, what if that is one of the midpoints on the piano? Piano keyboards have 2 midpoints. There's a D and A flat or G sharp. If you play one of those notes and you go outward from them in both directions, each note after that has a mirror note. But only D and A flat don't have mirror notes. They are by themselves the center of a symmetry. So I said, okay, what if this was D here, and then I put an equidistance, I put A flat, and then if I put the other notes, this equidistance from that, where would it go? And I ended up with this pattern that you see on the ground here, which has this triangle in the middle. And in this case, this one is oriented from this direction here, so that this note right here, this pole, is the note D, and that note at the top is A flat. And actually what's shown there on the screen is very similar to what I did. The pattern is the same, but I ultimately change the order of the notes into a way that makes more sense. But that's kind of what I was doing. That's the first thing I came up with. And I liked that pattern. And so I was showing Mike that pattern, and he said, well, have you ever been to a Bavarian beer festival? And I said, I had not. And he said, well, they have these trees that are kind of an equidistance apart, and then they have this whole canopy overhead, and they have tables and everything underneath it, and people get under there and they drink lots of beer, and it's a great, great time. And so we kind of thought, well, maybe there's something to this. In the meantime, I had already started building things in this shape, and I had an assistant at the time who could weld, especially aluminum, and we started welding up all kinds of things and making them three-dimensional and doing all kinds of things. And this has a life of its own. You'll discover that. Anyway, that's kind of the very first beginning of this, and it just grew and grew. And I decided that, having done other public art pieces, the big problem is that they all require maintenance. And somebody has to take care of these things, and if you make it too complicated or too many things going on, you're saddling somebody else usually with a bunch of maintenance work to do. So I thought, next time I build something, it's going to be kind of bomb-proof, and it won't require maintenance, and it can hail on it, and it can snow, and that's partly the reason why there is no roof on this. And it's both for effect, because it's a strong effect. You want it to have a roof, and there isn't one, so it's I don't know, it stays with you even, actually. So I started playing around with, well, what do I do with, I got my 12 notes, and then my daughter Liza saw the pattern and did an image search, and she discovered an article from Science magazine about a guy, Dan Schechtman, a chemist, who theorized that there could be crystals that could be non-periodic. Most crystals grow in a periodic form. They, like in tiling, if you've ever seen repeating shapes. And he theorized that you could have actually a non-repeating crystal. And then in the early 2000s, he actually created such a thing in his laboratory, and he won the Nobel Prize for that. And in this article about that, it showed an example of a quasicrystal pattern. And of course, he was arriving at it by bouncing photons off of some sort of metal, some alloy of some sort. But within that pattern was this shape. And I was surprised about that, and that shape recurs throughout this quasicrystal shape. And then I realized that this particular shape had so much information within it that I did not understand. It was like just a well, any direction you could go. I didn't understand the geometry of it, or the math, the chemistry, all this kind of stuff. And it led me in so many directions that I decided that that was how the growing part of the tree was going to be conceptualized, by information and by the new things that I would learn and the directions that it would go. And so here we are all these years later. It is actually, this thing is here. It is pretty indestructible. Mike said at one point, somebody, architect, suggested, could we maybe move it, rotate it a little bit? And that's very difficult to do, but at any rate, then I was always wanted it to be interactive, and it still has a lot of life left in it, a lot of things left to develop. But lighting it is kind of crazy because it's just a skeletal framework. I mean, there's not usually when you light things up, you want to have a big surface that can reflect a lot of light, and this thing doesn't. And we tried all kinds of ways of using light. And I had always wanted to use, instead of using these LED lights, which at the time were, I thought, just terrible looking, you know, Christmassy light type of things, I wanted to use projectors and get the colors from things like film and video and project those kinds of colors. But again, there's hardly anything to project onto. And so years passed, I thought of all kinds of things, and then I ran into someone who is a projection expert. And I thought, wow, somebody who finally can help me with projections. And I met Tito, who is responsible for all these, how many? 18,600 individually assignable LED lights that are on here that are controllable in so many different ways. You can program it with code, you can play video through it. But for me, of course, what I wanted to do was play my musical pattern through it. So this is what you see, is that this, you can play with musical instrument, digital information, I guess it is MIDI. You can play MIDI through this, and it will play in this big shape. Every note can correspond to these 12 points. But then, if you look at the canopy, it is made up of smaller versions of this same shape, which has always fascinated me, that in things like the Mandelbrot set or chaos theory, you keep finding shapes that are self-referring at different scales. And I wanted to represent that. And I wanted to try and give a hint towards the quasi-crystal idea. And so that's how it ends up with the shape, which obviously can be programmed to do many different things. But one way is to have each of these beehives, which we've called the original shape, can be a different octave, for instance, a different octave, and they also can show the notes as it's played. Anyway, enough talking. That's kind of how this came to be, and Mike and Amanda are so wonderful. They're incredibly patient, and they took this on, even knowing that I had already done another project for them that took years. So it's just remarkable that it's just been such a wonderful process. Anyway, I hope you are now part of this whole experiment, and it really is an experiment to see where this goes. That's why it took so long, because it had to go where it went, and here you are. And there will be more new things happening, performances. It's obviously a part of Bristol. This is part of the Bristol complex here, and what they choose to do with it is a big part of what will happen, but it'll involve the community, and it'll involve art and music and new incredible things. So thank you all for coming out, and we're now going to fly by the seat of our pants and try some new things. And to kick it off, we're going to do the reverse ball drop here. Woo! And we have Liza and Smith to illuminate this, and
Thank you.